What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Guys at Magic. My name is Dave. I'm going to be your host for today. I'm taking you through a deck tech of Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. When this card was spoiled, I was super high on it. She actually does pretty much everything that I was hoping that she would do, so I think it's pretty interesting. I know that a lot of people on the internet have kind of been either really high on her or a little pessimistic, kind of saying that they don't like the Staxy feel of this commander. For those of you who are curious, though, we're not really wanting to go in that kind of a direction, so we're really trying to be able to maximize those permanents entering the battlefield abilities. That's really what I want to make sure that we kind of get the most out of here. So to go ahead and kick this thing off, Elesh Norn is 5 mana, so she's 4 and a white. She's a legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor. She's a 4/7 with vigilance, and she says, if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. So all of your things will ETB kind of twice, and then your opponent's things, if they had ETBs, are just going to be kind of silenced. They'll be shut down there. On the surface, she is a little bit more on the controlling side of things. If you do drop this into play, your opponents are going to have to be very aware that any of their ETBs are just simply not going to work, which is fantastic. It's a ton of value just at that. But we can really take advantage of her ability to make sure that we can start to double all of our ETBs. And that's really the direction that this deck is going to be going in. So I know that you can build her a little bit more on the Staxy kind of controlling angle of things. That's actually not the direction I wanted to take this in. For those of you who enjoy that kind of gameplay, that's fantastic, and I'm all here for it. But I'm looking to do some other shenanigans instead. So with that being said, we have a ton of creatures that we've included into this list. In fact, actually, nearly half the deck is going to be creatures, because what we're trying to do really make sure that we have all these fun toys for us to be able to play and use and abuse once our commander's in play. The first group of creatures all do something somewhat similarly. We have Spirited Companion, which is 1 and a white. It's an enchantment creature dog. It's a 1/1. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Inspiring Overseer is 2 and a white for a creature angel cleric. It's a 2/1 with flying, and it says whenever it enters battlefield, you gain a life and you draw a card. And Priest of Ancient Lore is 2 and a white for a 2/1 creature dwarf cleric. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Normally, these creatures aren't really all that great on their own, but in a deck like this, though, where you have the potential to have your commander out and make sure you get 2 of those ETBs, so to be able to draw 2 cards off of this group of creatures, that's fantastic. And we do have a couple of other flicker targets and flicker abilities later on, so these cards can help us to churn through our deck a little bit faster. Loyal Warhound is 1 and a white for a creature dog. It's a 3/1 with vigilance and says whenever it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Aresko's Explorer is 1 and a white for a creature cat scout. It's a 2/2 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to X plains cards, where X is the number of players who control more lands than you. Reveal those cards, put them under your hand, then shuffle. Solemn Simulacrum is 4 mana. It's a 2/2 artifact creature golem. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle. It also says whenever Solemn Simulacrum dies, you may draw a card. Knight of the White Orchid is 2 white mana for a 2/2. It's a creature human knight. It's got first strike and says whenever it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a plains card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. And Core Cartographer is 3 and a white for a creature core scout. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a plains card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. I didn't want to explain each one of these creatures just kind of as I went through them, because essentially they kind of all do the exact same thing. They're helping us to be able to make sure that we're making our land drops, we're not falling behind the rest of the table. If one of our opponents is ramping, this is going to help to make sure that we're playing the catch up and or potentially even just ramp game as well. So we're going to be churning through our deck a little bit faster. I also do love all of these cards for potential flicker targets later on, to be able to grab extra plains from our deck or those extra basic lands, because it helps to start to thin our deck out a little bit more. And of course, who doesn't like having more lands in play? That gives you more resources and more options to do things. We have 2 modal creatures in this deck, both of which I think are very important because of their flexibility. The first one is Charming Prince. This is 1 and a white for a creature human noble. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may choose 1. You can scry 2, gain 3 life, or exile another target creature you own, return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. I really love Charming Prince, especially for that last ability there too, because you're going to be able to double up on ETBs. So if you do want maybe 2 of these abilities, you can't always do that. And he allows you to flicker things as well with that 3rd ability. Dawnbringer Cleric is 1 and a white. It's a 1/3 creature human cleric. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose 1. The first mode on it allows you to gain 2 life. Second mode says destroy target enchantment. And the third mode says exile target card from a graveyard. Similarly, with Charming Prince, there's a lot of flexibility here. A lot of these modes are going to come in handy at different parts in the game, and because they are kind of like Swiss Army knives and that they can do a lot of different things, I love including these creatures. We have 4 other creatures in this deck that allow us to be able to make some tokens, which I do think is going to be pretty important. This helps to not only just create a board presence for us, but as you'll see here later on, we want a lot of creatures in play, or at least we want a lot of creatures entering play. So all of these cards are going to be pretty important for it. The first one here is Blade Splicer. This is 2 and a white. It's a creature human artificer. It's a 1/1 on its own, but it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 golem artifact creature token. It also says the golems you control have first strike. So for 3 mana, you essentially get 4 power, 4 toughness, and 3/3 of that, also having a nice little keyword on top of it too. Master Splicer is pretty similar. This is 3 and a white for a creature human artificer. It's a 1/1, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token, and golems you control get +1/+1. So kind of similar in this regard. The wonderful thing here being obviously is doubling up on those ETBs. So with that being said, I mean, just looking at something like Blade Splicer on its own, for 3 mana, if your commander's in play, you get 2 3/3s with first strike, and you get a 1/1 body on top of it too. I mean, it is just a ton of value. Mage's Attendant is 2 and a white. It's a creature cat rogue. It's a 3/2, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 blue wizard creature token with pay 1 and sacrifice the creature to counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. This one's pretty interesting because not only does it allow you to make those additional tokens, so it gives you that flexibility that you don't typically see in just like a mono white deck. The ability for you to kind of interact with your opponents through counter magic is kind of interesting and not something that they may necessarily be expecting. Lastly here we have a Maria Angel. This is 2 and 2 white for a total of 4 mana. It's a 3/3 creature angel. It's got flying and landfall. It says whenever a land enters battlefield under your control, you may create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying. Although this doesn't actually have an ETB stable onto itself, you're going to be able to get additional landfall triggers with this card, which is going to be wonderful for you. Start to come up your board with all of those bird tokens. Plus, because this is a token producer in and of itself, anything that we care about later on for creatures entering the battlefield, those birds will trigger too. So far we've talked about some of the creatures that are just kind of good flexibility. We've talked about some of the creatures in here that help to support creating a board presence for us, as well as some of the ones that kind of ETB, maybe help us draw cards or talk about how we can get our lands a little bit more situated. The next part of the creature package here focuses a little bit more on kind of a sub-theme within the deck, and this one being a little bit more focused on life gain. So, Ariok Champion is going to be included in this list. It's 2 white mana. It's a creature human cleric. It's a 1/1 and it says it has protection from black and from red. Means it's kind of a pain in the butt for your opponents to deal with. It also says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you may gain 1 life. So this is going to be an ETB for essentially any creature that comes into play, and that's going to include all of your opponent's creatures as well. This is really powerful because instead of just gaining 1, you'll actually gain 2 so long as you have Elesh Norn in play. This is going to be able to have you pad your life total pretty well, and it'll also allow us to potentially weaponize life gain, as you'll see with some of the other cards included later on. Similarly to Ariok Champion, though, we have a couple other creatures in here that kind of do the same thing. The first one here is Suture Priest. This is 1 and a white for a creature cleric. It's a 1/1 that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain 1 life. And whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you may have that player lose 1 life. So a little bit more of a damage dealer here. Daxos Blessed by the Sun is 2 white mana for a 2-star. It's a legendary enchantment creature demigod. It says its toughness is equal to your devotion to white, and whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield or dies, you gain 1 life. Soul Warden is a single white mana for a creature human cleric. It's a 1/1 and says whenever another creature comes into play, you gain 1 life. And Soul's Attendant is a single white mana for a 1/1 human creature cleric. It says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you may gain 1 life. So all of these essentially kind of do the exact same thing for us. They kind of all just pad our life total, make sure that we're constantly gaining life, and it really does synergize incredibly well with our commander. Now, if we are going to be gaining all of this life, obviously we want to be able to do something with it. So included in this list, we also have Heliod Suncrowned. This is 2 and a white for a legendary enchantment creature god. It's a 5/5 with indestructible. It says so long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Heliod isn't a creature. And whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control. You can also pay 1 and a white, and it says another target creature gains lifelink until end of turn. Heliod goes absolutely ballistic in this deck, so long as we have any of those Soul Sisters in play, so any of the cards that gain you life that I mentioned previously. Archangel of Thune is included in this list as well. This is 3 and 2 white. It's a creature angel. It's a 3/4. It's got flying and lifelink. It also says whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Same kind of thing here. It's going to be able to spread the love, make sure that if all our smaller creatures start to get gigantic, Archangel of Thune is generally a card that our opponents are going to need to kill as soon as possible. Next up in our creature package, we have a couple of cards here that really care about flickering effects, so trying to make sure that we get to reuse some of those wonderful ETBs we've talked about so far. First one here is Restoration Angel. This is 3 and a white for a total of 4 mana. It's a creature angel. It's a 3/4. It's got flash and flying. It also says that whenever it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-angel creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Eldrazi Displacer is 2 and a white for an Eldrazi creature. It's a 3/3. It has Devoid, which basically means that the card is technically colorless. It also has an ability on it where you can pay 2 and a colorless to exile another target creature, then return that creature to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Faladar Guardian is 3 and a white for a 1/4 creature cat beast. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. And Flicker Wisp is 1 and 2 white for a creature elemental. It's a 3/1 with flying. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, exile another target permanent. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. All of these cards essentially allow us to be able to reuse ETBs, either whenever they themselves come into play, or with Eldrazi Displacer through an activated ability. Now, we do have a couple of larger targets in this, or a couple of ways for us to be able to interact a little bit more with our opponents. So the first card here is Cavalier of Dawn. This is 2 and 3 white for a total of 5 mana. It's a creature elemental knight. It's a 4/6 with vigilance, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. It also says whenever it dies, return target artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. Because it has that wonderful ETB staple onto it, we want to make sure that we drop our commander first and use this to blow up 2 of our opponent's things. Sun Titan is 4 and 2 white for a 6/6 creature giant. It's got vigilance, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent with converted mana cost of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So a nice little way for us not only to be able to reuse some of those ETBs, but just to get some of our creatures or permanents back in general. Fiend Hunter is 1 and 2 white for a creature human cleric. It's a 1/3, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may exile another creature. It also says whenever it leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Serra's Emissary is one of the big beaters and payoff cards in this deck. It is 4 and 3 white. It's a total of 7 mana for a creature angel. It is a 7/7 with flying and says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a card type. You and creatures you control have protection from the chosen card type. So essentially what we're trying to do here is potentially either protect our board, make sure that our creatures can push in for damage, or whatever you need. So long as your commander was in play before you cast Serra's Emissary, you can use that ability to name 2 different card types. Court Street Denizen is 2 and a white for a creature human soldier. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever another white creature enters the battlefield under your control, tap target creature and opponent controls. This is a way for us to essentially make sure that our tapping our opponent's creatures down, maybe give us a window to be able to attack in without having to worry about what our opponent has on block duty. Or maybe even give us a window where we're tapping some of our opponent's creatures down and kind of incentivizing many of our other opponents to start swinging in and averting their damage that way. Skyclave Apparition is 1 and 2 white for a total of 3 mana. It's a creature core spirit. It's a 2/2 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with converted mana cost of 4 or less. It says whenever it leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the converted mana cost of the exiled card. So you'll be able to grab 2 of their things. If Skyclave Apparition does end up leaving later on, they're probably going to get something fairly sizable because you are going to be able to take care of 2 things. So they could potentially get an 8/8. Just kind of keep that in mind. And then also included here, we have Elite Spellbinder in kind of our interaction or mess with our opponent's package. And this is 2 and a white for a creature human cleric. It's a 3/1 with flying and says whenever it enters the battlefield, look at target opponent's hand. You may exile a non-land card from it. As long as this card remains exiled, its owner may play it, and a spell cast this way costs 2 more to cast. So all of these cards allow us to be able to interact with our opponents, trip them up a little bit, maybe make it to where our creatures are capable of getting in, or potentially just kind of get rid of some of their nasty creatures. We do have 3 creatures in this list that all have an ETB that allows us to kind of tutor through our library. The first one here is Recruiter of the Guard. This is 2 and a white for a creature human soldier. It's a 1/1 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with toughness 2 or less, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Ranger of Eos is 3 and a white for a creature human soldier. It's a 3/2 and says whenever it comes into play, you may search your library for up to 2 creature cards with converted mana cost of 1 or less, reveal them, put them into your hand, and if you do, then shuffle your library. And lastly, Ranger Captain of Eos is 1 and 2 white. It's a creature human soldier. It's a 3/3 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost of 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. You can also sacrifice Ranger Captain of Eos to have it to where your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. The wonderful thing about all of these creatures is that since they tutor on their ETB, if your commander's in play, you'll be able to double up on it. Ranger of Eos, for example, will allow you to go and search your library for up to 4 creature cards, which is a huge effect. Not only does it have the ability for you to kind of set up your own board state and potentially even refill your hand, but just the insane amount of value off of that. Keep in mind too, you can flicker any of these creatures to get additional value. To wrap up our creature package, we have 3 more creatures included in here that are just kind of good stuff, just general good value, or allow us to kind of have a little bit more protection for our commander. The first one here is Giver of Runes. This is 1 white mana for a creature core cleric. It's a 1/2 that says that you can tap it to give another target creature you control gain protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Similarly, Mother of Runes is a single white mana for a 1/1. It's a creature human cleric. You can tap her and have target creature you control gain protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. They are somewhat similar. Essentially, what you can do is just kind of make sure that your commander is going to stay in play for a bit longer. Elesh Norn does have the tendency of drawing a little bit of hate, especially since she shuts down your opponent's ETB's effects. So these can be really important and really critical that you get them into play early. Lastly, to wrap up our creature package, we have Mentor of the Meek. He is 2 and a white for a total of 3 mana. It's a creature human soldier. It's a 2/2 and says whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, draw a card. We have tons and tons and tons of small little creatures in this deck, plus a couple of ways for us to be able to make some tokens past that point. So Mentor of the Meek has the potential to just kind of sit around as a draw engine. All right, moving forward, we do have several instants and sorceries in this list. The first group that we're going to talk about essentially are all focused on interaction. We do have 2 board wipes, the first one being Farewell. This is 4 and 2 white for a sorcery. It says choose 1 or more. Exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, or exile all graveyards. This is kind of a huge panic button. Not only can it kind of just nuke the entire board, but it can also clean up any of those graveyards in the case your opponents are playing around with those too. Obviously, since this is modal, don't choose the one that's going to hurt you. Interact with your opponents however you see fit given the situation. There's also Dusk and Dawn in this. Dusk is 2 and 2 white for a sorcery. It says destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. Dawn is 3 and 2 white for a total of 5 mana. It's a sorcery with Aftermath. Aftermath, the way that this works is that you can cast it from your graveyard. Then you exile it out. So ideally, you would cast Dusk first, then Dawn second. Dawn says return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. So it is a bit of a board wipe that doesn't necessarily hit everything, but the Dawn portion of the card is really important because it allows us to grab a ton of our creatures back from the graveyard. We are playing mono white, so I'm going to be throwing both Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile in this. They're both single white mana instant speed tricks that allow us to exile a target creature. Swords to Plowshares will have that creature's controller gain life equal to its power, and Path to Exile will allow them to search their library for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped. Both of these cards generally are just some of the best removal in the format, so it would probably be a mistake to not include them. Our last single target removal spell here is Generous Gift. This is 2 and a white for an instant. It says destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. I love the flexibility of Generous Gift, and although you are going to give them an elephant, chances are the 3/3 isn't going to do much less work than whatever it is that you just destroyed. We have a couple of other instants and sorceries in the deck to talk about. The first one here being Brave the Elements. This is a single white mana for an instant. It says choose a color. White creatures you control gain protection from the chosen color until the end of turn. I love the flexibility of this card because you can use this to protect your things by giving them protection for the color of your choice. You can also use it to set yourself up to potentially kill somebody off with combat damage. If you're playing up against a deck that you notice, I don't know, maybe only has a couple of green creatures left on block duty, you can always slam this down, name green, and then all of a sudden your creatures just can't be blocked by that player. Ephemerate is in this list. This is a single white mana for an instant. It says exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It's also got Rebound. Rebound says that if you cast a spell from your hand, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. So you kind of get this effect twice. Ephemera is wonderful to be able to reuse and abuse any of those ETBs we've talked about earlier. It can also be a great card to allow us to protect whatever piece is critical to our board state by exiling out whatever our opponent is trying to remove. Teferi's Protection is in this list. This is 2 and a white for an instant. It says until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out, and you would exile Teferi's Protection. So Teferi's Protection included in this list is kind of a panic button. I know that some people may not necessarily be the biggest fan of the card. However, we did have enough within kind of the general budget of this deck, and it does pull its weight, so I felt like it was a pretty solid include. Ascend from Avernus is in this list as well. This is an X and 3 white for a sorcery. It says return all creature and planeswalker cards with mana value of X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Exile Ascend from Avernus. Ascend from Avernus is quickly becoming one of my favorite cards to kind of like rebuild your board after a board wipe. So I'm loving this card. In the case things do go south, your opponents start killing a lot of your creatures off, or your graveyard just does start to accumulate some other means. Ascend from Avernus has the ability to grab a ton of your creatures, assuming that you can still pay for it. As far as the artifacts go in this list, the first group that we're going to talk about are all mana rocks. Listed here, we have Soul Ring, Mind Stone, Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet, and Thought Vessel. These cards at this point are pretty much included in just about every EDH deck I can possibly think of, including pretty much every precon at this point too. Essentially, they all allow us to be able to accelerate up our game plan. They all function as mana rocks. And super important for this list in specific, Soul Ring, Mind Stone, and Thought Vessel can all tap for a colorless, which is actually oddly important for this deck because Eldrazi Displacer specifically needs colorless mana. So do keep in mind, they actually kind of pull double duty here. Oketra's Monument is in this list as well. It's 3 mana for a legendary artifact. It says white creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. It also says whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. Although not necessarily a mana rock like the other ones here, it does give us a reduction on, well, the majority of our deck, seeing as how most of them are white creatures. Also, that second ability there of being able to create that 1/1 white warrior creature token is super powerful. So I do love the ability that we can get an extra 1/1 whenever we start casting our things and hopefully triggering some of the other ETBs or other permanents care about ETBs. We have a couple more artifacts in this list. The first two we're going to talk about here are equipment. We have Lightning Greaves in this list. It is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature has haste and shroud, and it has an equip cost of 0. Elesh Norn is probably going to be the target of some removal over the course of the game, so Lightning Greaves does a pretty good job of not only making sure that she sticks around, but also making sure that she has haste, so she could potentially get in for some damage. Sword of Hearth and Home is making the list here as well. This is 3 mana for an artifact. Equipment. It says the equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from green and from white. Not necessarily the most relevant color pairing, but it does also have another ability on it that says, whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then search your library for a basic land card, put both cards onto the battlefield under your control, then shuffle. It's got an equip cost of 2. I love the ability to have Sword of Hearth and Home help us kind of ramp a little bit, maybe take advantage of any of the additional land ETBs that we'll have included in this deck. And then, of course, being able to flicker out one of our permanents is really powerful. 2 other artifacts that we have included in this list. The first one is Panharmonicon. This is 4 mana for an artifact. It says, if an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes the triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Kind of serves as a, I don't want to say a backup of our commander because things get a little bit nutty and it's not quite as impactful. Panharmonicon itself is definitely a way for us to be able to kind of continue to abuse our deck if our opponents do manage to shut out Elesh Norn, and if we get both in play at the same time, things get absolutely insane. The last artifact included in this list is Aetherflux Reservoir. This is 4 mana for an artifact. It says whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn. You can pay 50 life and have Aetherflux Reservoir deal 50 damage to target creature or player. You're probably going to name player unless there's a creature that for whatever reason you really need dead. Aetherflux Reservoir in and of itself is kind of an odd card, but this deck actually does a pretty good job of gaining a surprising amount of life, so this can serve as an alternative win condition. We have multiple enchantments we've got to talk about. The first one is Cathar's Crusade. This is 3 and 2 white for an enchantment. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Especially with our token makers included in this list, it's not uncommon for us to be able to get 3, 4, potentially even more creatures in play in the given turn. So that's a lot of +1/+1 counters, especially if we can double up on those effects. Felidar Retreat is 3 and a white for an enchantment with landfall. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1, create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. With their commander in play, we'll get to choose 1 twice. We've also got Teleportation Circle in this list. This is 3 and a white for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is an enchantment that just kind of sits around and allows us to continuously flicker our things in and out each turn. Grasp of Fate is an enchantment that we have included here that allows us to interact with our opponents. This is 1 and 2 white. It says whenever it enters a battlefield for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. So a nice little ETB that we can potentially abuse. It's going to help to narrow down some of our opponent's threats. Similarly here, we're going to include On Thin Ice. This is a single white mana for a snow enchantment aura. Whenever it comes in, you have to enchant a snow land that you control. It says, whenever On Thin Ice enters the battlefield, exile a target creature an opponent controls until On Thin Ice leaves the battlefield. And lastly, included in this kind of enchantment interaction package, we have Nevermore. Nevermore is 1 and 2 white for an enchantment. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, name a non-land card. The named card can't be cast. If you are playing up against an opponent who's running maybe a combo-heavy deck, you can always name one of the pieces of that combo to potentially shut them down. If you just want to be really mean, you can just name their commander and hope that you manage to sneak Nevermore out before they cast it. The last enchantment in this deck is just generally one that I've really enjoyed playing with. Thought it made a pretty good inclusion for the deck. So it is Omen of the Sun. This is 2 and a white. It's an enchantment with a flash and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll create 2 1/1 human creature soldier tokens and gain 2 life. You can also pay 2 and a white, sacrifice it, and scry 2. I love the fact that this is an enchantment with flash that has that ETB on it, because that means we could potentially double up on that effect. I love paying 3 mana for 4 power and 4 toughness across 4 bodies. Plus, I guess the gaining 2 life thing double up is pretty nice too. So that's going to wrap it up for kind of the meat and potatoes of the deck. Next up, we're going to dive into the mana base. Mana base for this deck is actually not as straightforward as what it probably could be, given that it's a monocolored deck. So the first group of cards we're going to talk about all kind of provide some degree of utility. The first one here is Castle Ardenvale. This is a land that says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a plains. You can tap it to add a white to your mana pool. You can also pay 2 and 2 white, tap it, and create a 1/1 white human creature token. So in the case, for whatever reason, you do have an install on your board state, this can be a nice little effect for you to be able to get back into the fight. Maybe a way for you to just kind of get some extra creatures to abuse some ETBs, or worst case scenario, you have something that can create a blocker. Aganjo, Seat of the Empire is a legendary land that you can tap to add a white. It's got channel of 2 and a white, which means that you'll discard it, and it deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So it does have a mana reduction ability there. Even at 3 mana, it's not a bad effect. This essentially is just going to function the same way as really any planes that you would have in the deck. It just kind of has the opportunity to have some additional upside. Emeria the Sky Ruin is a land that enters the battlefield tapped. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 7 or more planes, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can tap it for a white mana. 7 or more planes may sound like a lot, especially given the fact that there's actually only 20 of them in this list. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit, though. One of the things that I really want to mention with this, though, is if you recall, going back to the creatures we talked about earlier, there's a lot of creatures that have the ability to go and grab basic lands, and many of them specifically care about planes. So Emeria the Sky Ruin, actually not super difficult to turn on. We also have Hall of Heliod's Generosity. This is a legendary land. You can tap it to add a colorless mana. You can also pay 1 and a white and tap it to put target enchantment card from your graveyard back to the top of your library. So it's a little bit of recursion there specifically for enchantments. Hall of Heliod's Generosity is in here because some of our best win conditions are going to be through enchantments, things like Cathar's Crusade or Felidar Retreat. I also love the fact that this land taps for a colorless, which really is critically important given that one of the best creatures in this deck is Eldrazi Displacer. Core Haven is a legendary land that you can tap to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. You can pay 1 and a white and tap it to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt by target attacking creature this turn if you are playing up against an opponent that's playing a Voltron style strategy or potentially even Infect. This is a great way of kind of shutting down whatever creature might have been able to deal damage to you. Generally speaking, this deck is capable of gaining quite a bit of life, so it is definitely a nice little piece there that you have the flexibility option to, but this allows you to shut down potential Voltron strategies as well as Infect. So any of those like alternative ways for your opponents to kill you via combat damage, Core Haven does a great job of making sure that you'll survive that. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is included in this. It's a legendary land that you can tap to add 1 colorless to your mana pool. You can pay 2 and tap it. It says, choose a color, add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. So if your devotion to white is 5, you can pay 2 mana, tap it, and add 5 white mana to your mana pool. Nykthos is just really a super powerful land in any monocolor deck, so definitely jamming it in here. Reliquary Tower is a land that says you have no maximum hand size. You can tap it for a colorless. Rogue's Passage is a land that says you can tap it for a colorless or pay 4 to tap it and target creature can't be blocked this turn. And War Room is a land that you can tap to add a colorless. You can also pay 3, tap it, and pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity, which is 1, and draw a card. Seems like a lot of colorless lands that are going to be included in this deck, but just as I've mentioned earlier, they are a critically important part to this list, so would strongly recommend that you do include. We do have 3 lands in here that kind of can tutor for lands themselves. The first one is Terramorphic Expanse. It's land that you can tap it, sacrifice it, and search your library for a basic land card. Put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. Second one here is Evolving Wilds, which actually does the exact same thing. And then the last one is Fabled Passage. This is a land that you can tap it, sacrifice it, and search your library for a basic land card. Put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Then, if you control 4 or more lands, untap that land. So, pretty similar, but potential upside in that you might be able to untap that land. So all 3 of these are going to be included in the list. Essentially, I wanted these cards in here because I know that Felidar Retreat is in the list and kind of important as a potential win condition, just because it has the ability to either make creatures force or put +1/+1 counters on things. So I wanted fetch lands in the list. Obviously, these are not fetch lands. We're in a mono white list, so only so many things we can get away with, and I don't really want to blow the price tag off this. We have 2 other lands included in here that both serve as kind of just like functional pieces. The first one here is Ghost Quarter. You can tap it for a colorless. You can also tap it, sacrifice it, and destroy target land. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle their library. We also have Field of Ruin, which is a land that can tap for a colorless, or you can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land that opponent controls, and then each player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it on the battlefield, then shuffles. So essentially the way that I'm going to use these cards is basically just lands that can tap for a colorless, but if we do happen to have an opponent land that does need to die, Field of Ruin and Ghost Quarter can get the job done for us. To wrap up this deck, we're going to talk about some of the basics. We are including 20 snow-covered plains in this list. That's right, they're all snowlands. The reason why I wanted to include snowlands specifically is so that On Thin Ice would work out, and there really isn't any real negative of playing snowlands over just like normal lands. So there's a couple of cards from Kaldheim that might trip you up, but I don't think I've ever seen any of them actually pop up in EDH. The last card included in this list is a Single Wastes. It's a basic land that can tap for a colorless, but because it is a basic land, it does allow us to be able to tutor for it with like Evolving Wilds to go search for it, as well as some of the other effects and cards in the deck. So I did want to make sure that we had at least 1 waste in here as an alternative means for us to be able to just make sure that we have something that allows us to use Eldrazi Displacer. All in all, I did want to make sure that this deck tech fell in line with the other deck techs on this channel. So $350 is just kind of like how our own meta shapes out. I feel like this is where most of our decks kind of fall in line, is around that price point. So that's kind of where I like to stick out for these deck techs. Obviously, you can go ahead and fiddle around with that if you're a little bit more on the budget end of things. Obviously, you can take some stuff out. There are plenty of lands that are going to be included in this list. It's a little bit more on the expensive side. There are also a couple of other cards that are not actually structurally important. Things like Teferi's Protection, that although is a very powerful card, is not required in order to make the deck hum, so feel free to make some alterations there. If you want to play with more expensive stuff, then by all means feel free to go ahead and throw whatever else you want into a list like this. Do us a huge favor. We love all the comments and feedback that y'all give to us. So if there was a different direction that you would like to take Elesh Norn in, maybe you do want to see her as more like a stack-based commander, feel free, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Let us know what you would have done with this list. Also, make sure to let me know what you do or don't like about this list. Any kind of feedback is wonderful for the channel. Make sure that, as always, you've liked and subscribed, and then follow us on our other social media platforms as well. We're on Instagram, we are on Twitter, we are on TikTok apparently. If you do want to check out this list, we also have the Moxfield link included in the description below. Thanks for sticking around with us, and hope you've enjoyed this video. Until next time, peace.